Well, the title is Who Rules America Today? And of course, its answers in the subtitle. I think the corporate rich do rule. They are the people that run finance, manufacturing, retail, big ag, and real estate. And how do they rule? How do they do this? Well, it's all there for anybody to see. It's all the stuff that's on. It's not in some deep, latent this and that and the other thing. It's lobbying, special tax breaks, that complex policy planning network, campaign finance, all the things that you've been exposed to. When wrapped up in the context of these networks and in the isolation of others that I'm going to talk about, the result is their success. And what do I mean by their success? What's the evidence that all this matters? Well, they win the legislative battles. Their wealth and income have grown. Inequality has grown. I will contend to you that since 1938-39, there's not been a single important legislative battle that has been won by the liberal-labor coalition. It won on Medicare, and it's won sort of on Obamacare, which was not what liberal-labor wanted. But on the others, it lost time after time after time. These legislations were compromised, and that's what I've done in my most recent book on the myth of liberal ascendancy, which I was not happy to conclude. But I did go back through all of this legislation. I've had help of others through compilations that they had made. And there have been losses on all of these things. So you can find details on all of this on my website, whorulеsamerica.net, or in the Who Rules America, or in the Myth of Liberal Ascendancy. But I want to tell a more general kind of story today, a story of ideas that I think it can be pretty familiar to you. And I'm going to talk in terms of the corporate rich, the corporations on the one side, and a liberal labor coalition on the other side. Now that's a big generalization in the following way. There are differences of opinion among the corporate rich. There's a moderate set of conservatives and an ultra-conservative set of conservatives. And I can tell you in detail, but don't have the time, because I might answer some of Jan's questions at the end. But the point is that's detail for what we're looking for. What's important is what they all share. And all corporate rich share fierce dislike for unions and a desire to get rid of unions. They share a desire for lower taxes. They share a desire for minimum regulation of their particular business. And if I want minimum regulation of my business, I need your help, and you want minimum regulation of your business, so we help each other. Even if it's finance, which is a disaster if you don't regulate it, because you get runs on banks. That's okay. We all want deregulation. We help each other. So those details then are of differences are unimportant. On the other side, there is a liberal labor coalition that developed in the mid-30s, and it too has all kinds of divisions in it that you know many of you have lived. But certainly there's differences among these unions, craft unions, industrial unions. There's differences among liberals and so on. I'm abstracting from that today, if you will, talking more generally, and trying to then give this sense of a much bigger kind of a picture. Okay, in that general picture, I also have used, and will mention some of the numbers, but not to, just to give you a sense of variation, and they're on that particular handout. But the point is, if we look very closely at what's called union density, what percentage of workers are in unions? And there's a couple, three different measures of that. The one that I've used on the handout is the one of what percentage of non-farm workers are in unions. I use that because it goes back further, but it's about the same. And it's a very interesting kind of curve, because it goes up and then it goes straight down. I also use an inequality measure called the Gini coefficient. And it does just the opposite, and that's what that funny looking first little graph is really about. And my talk is most of all about the first graph. The way in, it's the rise and fall of union density. On the other side, it's the decline and rise of inequality. am not claiming a causal relation, but I think they are the starting point for building a causal relationship, and I will give evidence of the kinds of things that did lead to those different kinds of things. I've also looked at a measure that was used in good part by, developed in good part by a historian on this campus, Elliot Brownlee. Now, like so many of my friends from Santa Barbara and me are retired. But he looked at the effective tax rate on the 1%. In other words, what do they really pay out of what they really get? And this is also a measure that has some dramatic kinds of changes that you will see at the appropriate kind of point. Now, I want to start by saying the key to understanding any country is to look at its history. Too big a comparative stuff, you get lost. Too big a structural stuff, it gets lost. The power structure is in the details of this particular country. And what I now next say may surprise you a bit, in terms of saying how do a corporate rich triumph, because I think it really begins with two incredibly important differences, important historical understanding about the United States. The first is you cannot appreciate enough, emphasize enough, the historical differences between the northern and the southern political economies that hugely mattered in shaping the United States, and certainly did into the 70s and the 80s, and really still does. And because of the fact that the South was a slave and then Jim Crow economy into the middle 60s, and still lots of exclusion after that, including then making unions anathema, there was no chance really for unions to develop except in the smallest enclaves in the southern United States. So a huge part of the country could not be part of a liberal labor coalition. Now that fact interacts with another fact, and that is the structure of our electoral system, which is just for pretty mundane historical reasons. We have a system that's called a single member district plurality system. That is, we have 2 senators, we have a certain number of people elected to the House from each state in a district, and we have somebody elected called president who has tremendous power from this one big district called the United States. And you can win with 42% if the other candidate's 41, 40, 39 down. And that system is not typical of the world. The world mostly has parliamentary kinds of systems, and some countries have systems where you get seats in the parliament depending on your percentage of votes. Which turns out to have been a strategy by big businesses in those countries, but it still led to a more fair system than what we have now, and I shouldn't get off in those historical asides to keep within the time limits. So the basic point is you are stone cold nuts to start a third party, as Nader did, as the progressives did in the 40s and so on. I forgive people in the 40s, but I don't forgive anybody since then that started a third party, because they could have read about what's happened to all the other third parties. Vote for a third party is a vote for your worst enemy. That's the system. I'm not going to try to argue that with you today. But the point is the interaction of those two facts, one a very structural fact, one a historical political economy fact, they left liberal labor people with no place to go. They sure weren't going to go in with the Republicans. They were totally anti-union. They threw in historical reasons with the Democrats. This I call a sordid bargain, because the liberal labor bargain with the South worked for them. Somebody excluded in that bargain. Guess who? It was African Americans were excluded from that bargain, because it means liberal labor will not do much in the South, and it means in turn in the North, for the northern workers, great. The northern white workers will keep the best jobs. And they had the highest jobs even in the industrial kinds of unions. So African Americans really were excluded from this, what was called the New Deal coalition. Now, without any kind of a party base, organizational base that could influence your consciousness about economics, about who's for unions, who's against unions, who's for you, who's against you, you're very likely to vote your other identities. which can be very salient for people historically all over the world. And the first one of those, of course, is people vote their race very, very often. And we're going to see this in the 60s. Secondly, they're likely to vote their religion in this situation. And there's been a difference in America for a long time. Say 75, 80% of Jewish people are voting Democrat. 20 percentage points less of Catholics are voting that. 50, 60% at one time. 50, 45 percentage. Now, Protestants, whatever their class, 20% less than the Catholics. So religion matters in American voting. Race matters in American voting. Recently, gender matters in American voting. And they have trumped class, in effect, economic interest, often in people's voting. And when that happens, this gives an opening for the Republicans, because you can, white people, white ordinary people share a skin color with the rich whites. They might share religion with the rich whites, and so on. Well-to-do white women that are married, live in the suburbs, don't vote their gender as often as some other women might. So these are factors that I've just mentioned that provide openings then for the Republicans. And the point then is, it's not somehow that our corporate rich are stronger than capitalists in other countries. It's the fact that the potential challengers are more divided. They have organizational bases. They have some unions. There's churches. There's this and that. Indeed, if we look at what was the organizational base of the civil rights movement, it was in good part churches. If you look at the organizational base of the right in the 70s and the 80s, it's good part churches. The Catholic Church really funded the beginnings of the anti-abortion movement, and so on. So the point is, corporations not suddenly in the 70s flex their muscles, get angry, and get organized. The situation that I've been talking about changed for them, and that's where I'm going to focus here. Well, this is global studies, so what about foreign policy and that whole global dimension? Well, with apologies, in terms of the issue of inequality in power in America, that was a relatively minor issue until the 1970s, and even then it became a more important issue, in part because the unions had been so weakened by the 1970s that there was no way they could stop certain kinds of legislation. Having said that, we have done studies. A couple of the articles in that very issue that Jan mentioned of the insurgent sociologists were about the way in which these same corporate guys that I'm talking about did plan, starting in 1939-40, once World War I started. They began planning for a post-war world that would be international in scope. And they had it all scoped out of what they needed. They needed Southeast Asia because that fit with the Japanese economy. They certainly needed to penetrate the British Empire, and the biggest fights the United States had in the 1940s economically were really with the British. Open that empire or we're going to screw you. You are now second banana. So that was a big fight from 40 to 46. Was reversing positions with the British on who's number one in the in the Anglo world, if you will. The reason that this internationalization didn't matter power-wise, the South and other right-to-work states fulfilled the same role. That is, you move the factory to Tennessee, you move the factory to Alabama. You soon move the factory to the Great Plains because right-to-work laws were passed, they were called, that really undercut, made it harder to develop unions. So they, in a power sense, those parts of the country played the role that is now played by China, or was played by the NAFTA and so on, or companies moving to Taiwan, which we would, we're all upset about, or moving to here or there. But they used to move with just as devastating consequences to the Northern Liberal Labor Coalition, to those southern states. So that's really the context then for that first particular graphic. And you can, and one point I want to make to you, which then gets me in trouble with the Liberal Labor Coalition, is to say, you can see the way in which, there's a certain way in which these big changes didn't have much to do with the Liberal Labor Coalition. What they had to do with was, first of all, the Great Depression, which did then elect this New Deal government, which in turn did one thing, starting in 35, 36, 37. They started to really tax the rich higher. And that starts to level things off just a tiny bit, but some. And so the effective tax rate on the 1% then went from 5 or 6%, up to 20-some percent. So they're starting to tax those well-to-do guys. The other thing that happened in the 30s that so much matters that relates to the context I just gave you was there was the passage of an act called the National Labor Relations Act, which put the government supposedly behind your right to organize a union and bargain. That act passed because the Southerners said okay. Why did the Southerners say okay? Because the Northerners said, hey, we need to pass this because we're after these corporations. But we're not after you. We'll exclude agricultural labor. Exclude also domestic labor. So all the servants, essentially the black workforce was excluded from this legislation. And the South was excluded, meaning the Southern rich. And the act passed. And it led to an explosion. The union density rate went up from 9% in 1936, and it was up in the 18% by 39, 40, when there was now a stall. But there was a huge explosion of this union organizing. And it looked like, wow, this could go on. And then you'll see why I say that. But something also happened that I want to put in the picture. It's like, uh-oh, sneaking in the bad guy from the side. And that is, as this racially integrated union organizing started in the North and partly moved south, the Southerners within that fast turned against that law because they didn't want it coming south, which it was. And they didn't like that at all through a union called the CIO. And from that day forward, they joined with their northern counterparts who had always been against this idea of unions to create what was called a conservative voting coalition in the Congress, which voted together. It's a majority of Northern Republicans voting with a majority of Southern Democrats against a majority of other Democrats, of non-Southern Democrats. That's the coalition that rules on class issues in America since 1938, because in 1938, Roosevelt also made a wonderfully fatal mistake. And this is why, like, history's no conspiracy or somebody has a big picture and so on. Roosevelt, he did want to build the confidence of the business guys, so we'll balance the budget. So that and a couple other things, and they really stopped doing pump priming spending. And you know what he did? He crashed the economy really like crazy. And now these people are out of work. It's harder to organize these resistant companies. Furthermore, you're losing union members because they're laid off. And they can't pay union dues and so on. The 1938 election, in good part due to this terrible recession, put enough Northern Republicans back in Congress, because they were down to virtually none. I mean, I could give the numbers, but it was ridiculous. There were 16 Republican senators after the 1936 election, to give you an idea. And there were like 485 Democrats, some of whom were Southerners, in the Congress, in the House. So there were now just enough Republicans to go with these Southern Democrats for that conservative coalition to rule America ever since on all these legislative issues, except what these Southern Democrats as Republicans. In other words, they have the same stance, only worse on certain issues. So they are Southern Democrats incarnate plus extra as far as conservatism. Because, you see, the Southerners needed subsidies for their agriculture. Southern agriculture was saved, as well as other agriculture, but especially the plantation capitalists of the South were saved by the New Deal, a gigantic bailout of subsidies, which are still around today, of agricultural price supports. They send you money. Don't grow crops this year on cotton. We got too much. Here's the check from the federal government, a quarter courtesy of Northern voters and taxpayers. So there's two coalitions in Congress. There's a conservative coalition and there's a spending coalition. The spending coalition, that's welfare spending, that's spending on real estate, roads and all that. Then the Northern Republicans and the Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats vote together. And they feed each other. So agricultural subsidies go to the south, and real estate subsidies go to the north. Many of you have read about this. Oh, it's the machine Democrats, and they're delivering to the workers. Well, they were delivering to construction workers, but you know what? They were also delivering to the developers of big real estate in the north. And those people, it gets complex. Those people happen to be immigrants into the United States, a whole lot of them, starting with the Irish. And you get a control of the city, and pretty soon you can put good stuff on your land. And then you are oiling the machine with your money. That happened for all of the immigrant people of the last part of the 20th century in the United States. And they became these people in these northern ethnic enclaves that were the machine Democrat. So that was the other cross-cutting coalition, and the Northern Republicans didn't like that at all. But they had these common interests on these class kinds of issues. Now there was kind of a stasis 39-40. It really wasn't like labor wasn't moving ahead. But partly because the Southerners were harassing the National Labor Relations Board so badly, but also they hit the really tough nuts to crack in the corporate community. What happened was the next thing that led to equality in America was World War II. World War II. Two ways. First of all, everybody's working or fighting. Working overtime. Rosie the Riveter. All of a sudden, African Americans have skills. They're brought north, every kind of thing. Everybody's working. That can do a hell of a lot to inequality. Secondly, they've got to tax these rich guys to pay for this war. And the effective tax rate went from the 20% I mentioned to you in 1944 is 54%. The rich people did pay a lot for this war. Mostly it was subsidized, but 22% of the war was paid for by the upper 1 or 2%. So they had to really tax them to do all this. So the real plummet in inequality is during World War II and its slight aftermath. Now, another thing happened that's really important during World War II. You're not going to fight that war when you didn't have a big military machine. They hadn't built a huge military. Isolationists, they were called, had stopped them. It was very meager. And they had a militant union movement. A lot of ethnicity, a lot of things are going on. And basically the government said, big capitalists, you ain't going to fight those unions during this war. And the union movement grew from 9 million to 15 million. And in 1945, it hit its peak on union density, a number I've memorized, of course, 35.4%. That was the highest ever. Right there square as that war was ending. Well, at that point, of course, then people had a lot of hope for this will continue. This will continue for liberal labor. Except after the war, it really didn't. It really did backslide. They lost a lot of legislative battles in that time period. And even though unemployment had stayed low in the 3%, 4% range, it popped up in 49-50 when they tried, oh yeah, we got to balance the budget and worry about a little tiny bit of inflation and so on. And then, oh boy, that'll be a miracle. And so, who took 5 minutes of my time, Eric? At any rate, the important, actually the story, as I said today, but the story really does end in about 72. The game is over. But you might say, oh, wait a second, there's all this important stuff we lived through, which is true, but not in terms of the power structure. The next thing, what happened? Korean War. Korean War. Got to tax the rich again. Got to get these people back to work. The unemployment goes as low as ever been since World War II. Never again. It was down 2.9% in about 52 or 53. So everybody's working again. You're taxing the rich for the war. And in 53 was the point where the Gini coefficient, the inequality coefficient, reached its lowest point, 1953. Now it starts up. The Republicans are in charge. The war's over. You can get the message. I've only got 10 minutes. Can you imagine? I'm only in 1950. So, so at any rate, things are going the wrong way again. Now comes the 60s. And in the 60s, I want to emphasize a couple of things to you about the 60s. It's also about us, or some of us that are here, that were back then can think about this and see if they agree and so on and so forth. But the point is that in the 60s, Kennedy, you get the country moving again, youth. You've heard all the images of Kennedy. But the real eyes were on the civil rights movement. That was the excitement. That was the action. That's what created the Northern New Left, and so on. I got lost because I was going to mention somebody, but I can't. I don't have the time here. The point is, then, we're watching the civil rights movement like crazy. Kennedy is dragging his feet in all kinds of ways. But what we overlooked was he made two really good appointments to the National Labor Relations Board, and they made some rulings that really upset the corporate guys. Now, the corporate guys had never decided to have a deal with unions. They weren't satisfied. They were fighting them every minute. But now they were really up on their hind legs because of particular rulings that I don't have, obviously, then time to get into. Furthermore, during Kennedy's time, there was an executive order. It was cautious, but it said public employees can unionize. And it didn't have all the little doodads that the union guys wanted, but it was enough. And public unions started up, and they started to grow. And there's still 37% of the public workforce is unionized. You know what it is for private? 6-7% right now. It's still 37% for the public employees union, but they're so damn small as a part of the workforce that only 10 or 11% of workers today are unionized from that 35.4% number that I mentioned to you. So, furthermore, Kennedy knew in a more liberal way that he was going to try what were called wage price guidelines, where the government would say, hey, don't raise those prices more than 2%. Don't ask for more than 2% in your contract, you workers over here. That was anathema to the workers, but also especially for business. So the point is, going on underground really was some tuggle and struggle with the corporate guys over the National Labor Relations Board, over public employee unions, over wage price guidelines, which never went anywhere. But the point is, he threw it out there, and they were afraid it might grow. So they really then resisted greatly, and that's why even moderate corporate people cannot be Democrats. That would just freak them out. So 1964 was the year of tremendous hope. LBJ won big. Goldwater was thrashed. The right was thrashed forever. There was a lot of hope at that time. The Civil Rights Act had passed. The Voting Rights Act was to pass the next year. And then there could be a black-white workers' coalition in the South. And there could be a National Liberal Labor Coalition. It was the hope of the UAW. It was the hope of their leaders. It had always been their hope in helping Southern African Americans was, if they could vote, we could get a Liberal Labor Coalition. What was the hope? What's the basis of this hope that turned out not to be so right? I think it's important that we really believed. I say we, there are a lot of people of the 60s believed a couple of the next 3 or 4 things I'm going to say, depending whether they were liberals or leftists. They believed that liberal ideology, the fact that we're melting pot and all that kind of talk, would eventually normalize also race relations. After all, they normalized ethnic relations. All the unmeldable white ethnics all of a sudden started to intermarry each other like crazy in the 70s and beyond. So that was going to happen. That was the liberal ideology. Social psychologists do studies, sociologists, studies showing people hang out together, they get used to each other, they get to like each other. There was all that kind of stuff. And perhaps most importantly, we all kind of believed people would vote their pocketbook, right? They had in '64. Surely these schmucks in these unions, the worst schmuck in the world, is not going to vote for a Republican, right? He knows the UAW could get crushed. Surely he would know that. So our thing about what's rational for them would be to vote for Democrats, even though they don't like blacks still, maybe. Okay, so none of it really turned out to be so true when it came to race relations. Basically what happened, heavy statement, because this is saying that other side of the triumph, the wonderful things that happened from the civil rights movement, everything it did, it totally dynamited the New Deal coalition. It dynamited the whole power structure basically because of that. Because in the South, what happened, we all know. The Southern whites all went pretty quickly into the Republican Party. LBJ told us that. We should have listened to him. When he signed the Civil Rights Act, he said, we can kiss the South goodbye for a couple generations. You know, so what his thing was. I didn't use quite his words, but that was the sentiments. But he certainly knew that that was going to happen. And the reason it didn't happen faster was that these Southern Democrats still controlled the Congress. You must understand that. They controlled all the key committees. They're not going to just quit. They control a party at that congressional kind of a level. And that mattered to them on the spending stuff that I've already told you about. So the South deserted. But one other thing that happened was tremendous clashes between black and white workers, especially in unions. And this was most of all in the craft unions. The craft unions would simply not let black people in their apprentice programs and in their unions. And that really created dynamite in these northern cities. But the second thing was, if you look at something like the UAW, very few of the craft workers, in the skilled workers they were called, in the UAW were black. More, you know, industrial, on the line, they were mostly, that's where black people were. That doesn't mean all those workers were black, but it sure means that's where black people were. Black people could sure see that kind of thing. So the result was it dynamited the liberal labor coalition because just enough white people started to vote Republican. Just enough. Now, I'm not saying all, because there were people that changed their minds and their attitudes and so on. But the UAW files say that half of their workers in key places were voting Republican by 1968. And in 1968, 60% of whites had voted for LBJ, and it was 40% of whites voted for Humphrey. In Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, 8 to 10% of people voted for the racist from the South named George Wallace, who was running on a third-party ticket. Those weren't black people voting for that ticket, I will tell you that. These were white workers voting of all classes were voting. That gives you an idea. And of course, the fact they didn't vote for Democrats was one of the reasons that Nixon won. Well, at this point, once Nixon's in office, he can change this National Labor Relations Board, and he does. And they make decisions that are very detrimental to labor and make it really possible for what was called outsourcing, which is when you take the work out of a factory. Now you can offshore it. You don't just outsource it, you send it to somewhere else. And so that's the power thing that matters, not, oh, there's better communication or there's better transportation. Yeah, there's those. But there's also this ability to just walk right over unions, ordinary people, when you send work overseas. They don't get any cut of the action. You don't charge a tariff on the re-imported goods that are all American goods made somewhere else. So this defeat in this time period, 68 to 72, was tremendously important then in changing. Now, there's one other part to this. I know I'm going over time, but what can you do when you got an academic wound up and he doesn't get to teach very often? So the point is that in 68, 69, the economy is really heating up, and it's once again almost as good a time unemployment-wise as it was in the Korean War. Not quite, but it was pretty low. Everybody's working. We're coming on the line. You go get a job anywhere. Drop out of school, you get a job. Yeah, professors' jobs are everywhere. Big deal. So on. I mean, so it was really a tight labor market. But in that context, as inflation took off, and they tried to do moderate conservatives actually said, let's raise taxes on people. No, that's the best way to do it. That's the way to solve inflation. Conservative voting coalition said, no, we ain't going to do it that way. We're going to solve inflation on the backs of ordinary people. We're going to screw them because their wages are going to remain the same and inflation is going to happen. They wouldn't raise taxes. Now, you got a choice then. You can kill inflation another way. You can raise interest rates. And that's what they were forcing as a policy choice, because you raise interest rates and you automatically create unemployment through no housing starts, this and that, less investment, and so on and so forth. So these construction unions were driving them crazy in 69, 70, because as inflation happened, in construction unions got cost of living raises. So you'd see headline, you know, carpenters get 20% raise, you know, plumbers in San Francisco now making 30% more than they used to, and all of this, you know. Well, damn, workers are causing inflation, you see, was the way that they put out the blame. And with the Republicans in charge, and this is again key, they could then jimmy with the Department of Labor so that they could bring in people of color and bigger apprentice programs to undercut these white construction unions. And they did. They succeeded. And this was the origin of what was called the Business Roundtable. They started as the Construction Users Anti-Inflation Roundtable. So if people tell you that they organized because they were upset about the environment or OSHA or regulation, I think they're all wet. But they did then really do a job on these construction unions as well in that particular kind of point. That was really the ball game right there. From then on, from 1969 on, the inequality ratchets up and the unions are going down, a little bit masked by the rise of the public employee kind of union. Now, hope still sprang eternal. The Watergate Congress. In came a very liberal Congress in '74. But it wasn't quite liberal enough, and the Democrats said, we don't quite have enough to win. We're going to wait till '76. We'll make some procedural changes. So no legislation of any importance happened from that Congress of '74, '76. And then Carter won. And then that we'll swallow. He's a born again, and everybody swallowed hard, but you know, he's a Democrat and this and that. But the conservative voting coalition was strong enough by then because of this more whites became Republicans, and nothing happened that was positive for liberal labor. Basically, the Carter administration was an absolute rout for the liberal labor coalition. It was an absolute destruction those years. Tax cuts, everything. But the bigger deal, of course, was then in came Reagan. But we now overlook that. Previous cuts, and Reagan then came in, and we all know, I think from myth or actuality, that he shredded the labor movement. He made some appointments to the National Labor Relations Board that were so openly hostile to unions, so openly wild people, that it's hilarious to read about them. And they all hated each other, but they finally would all vote against they would just write us at each other. They all voted then to destroy the unions. Other things were destroying the unions as well. But the other thing, of course, they did was huge tax cuts, because that's what's killing us, was huge Bush cuts, huge Reagan cuts. Can't run the government without money, but their whole goal is to starve the government. But the point I want to make to you is that even with Reagan in the presidency, and even with a stronger conservative voting coalition of Republicans, they couldn't have won. They couldn't have won these things if all Democrats had stayed with them. But by then, the Southern Democrats were open about what they were. And it was called the Conservative Democratic Forum in the one house, one branch of Congress, and the Conservative Democratic Conservative Coalition in the other. And so there were a dozen or 14 senators that were in this, 12 of them from the South and one from Arizona and one from Nebraska. There were 47 House Democrats that were in this openly conservative coalition, 43 from the South, 4 from rural areas, upstate New York, Nebraska, Arizona, who were trivial. But the point is, again, now you're still the same South, North, not moderate conservative, not liberal labor, were voting together. Ultra-conservatives were voting together, and they'd been strengthened by this racist religious backlash that then came to dominate Congress. And that really was, and I was going to end with this by saying that really was the ball game right there. But then that's, if anybody under 30 or 50, well, God damn him, he's leaving us out, and there's all these struggles, and there were wars and everything else. But what were the big issues? Well, there was NAFTA, and there was normal trade with China. What did they do? They finished off the union movement. There was the end of welfare as we know it, and today, right now, there are people going to starve because we don't have the welfare as we knew it from the 30s onward. The Bush tax cut was certainly a big deal, and it all got baked in by the Democrats, 98% of it by 2009, and the rest of it in the last deal, except for the top 0.5%, and they got some of their tax restored. So the government's locked out of money. That's the key point of those cuts. And we did get Obamacare. And Obamacare is a major change. And to read in the paper is very moving for me to read about a woman in West Virginia saying, you can't tell you what a load it is off my mind to know I have protection. That's what liberal labor has always been about. It's been about that kind of compassion, that kind of empathy with others. And there's all kinds of evidence that people have had a huge load off their mind and will get care for the first time because of Obamacare and expansion of Medicaid, which of course the southern states and the Great Plains states aren't going to let happen in their goddamn state, right? So that's a dramatic change. But I want to say to you, it's not a liberal labor change. Liberal labor said, we want single payer, as it was called, which should have been called and is often called Medicare for all. That's what we want, Medicare for all. Extend it down 10 years. Extend it down for anybody that's worked for 20 years and suddenly laid off without a job. Extend Medicare to them. We didn't get that. We got Obamacare, which is run through the private insurance companies and will cost the country in general extra because it's enormously enriching this whole medical industrial kind of complex. So I think that's where we are. I think because in some ways sounds like a gloomy message, even though it's a class struggle message, it's a class struggle that says it was lost by workers for a variety of reasons, but certainly with race as a huge factor in that loss. But I reread Mills's answer to his critics on the power elite and his critics from the left. And he said, and they had all said, well, it's gloomy, it's elitist, it's this and that. He said, it seems like they're judging the reality of this analysis on the basis of an optimism-pessimism dimension. And Mills had this great quote, and that I always have liked. He said, he said, from my point of view, he says, first I want to get it straight. He said, I want to get it straight. And then, if it's cheerful, great. If it's not cheerful, that's too bad. But I think we got to get it straight. And that's my best straight shot right at you today. Thank you very much. Glad to answer questions.